Hi everyone, my name is Nicole Johnson, and I'll be introducing our first panel of the day, which is titled Critical Race Theory and Why It Matters. Critical race theory is a theoretical framework in the social sciences that focuses upon the application of critical theory, a critical examination of society and culture, to the intersection of race, law, and power. Our presenters for this topic are intellectuals and professionals, all of whose work has focused on race relations throughout different periods in history. Our first panelist is Pamela Newkirk. Newkirk is both a professor and the director of undergraduate studies in NYU's Journalism Institute. Her latest book, Spectacle: The Astonishing Life of Oda Benga, won the 2016 NAACP Image Award and is the inspiration for our first part of this panel, which is titled The Lessons of Ota Benga. Our second panelist is Peggy Cooper-Davis, a professor of lawyering and ethics in the NYU School of Law. Davis also directs NYU's Experiential Learning Lab, which develops learning strategies for addressing interpretive, interactive, ethical, and social dimensions of legal practice. Her panel is titled The Enduring Constitutional and Cultural Legacy of United States Slavery. Our final panelist for this topic is Mathias Möschel. Möschel is currently the acting chair of the Comparative Constitutional Law program at Central European University. His research focuses on comparative constitutional law, international human rights law, and non-discrimination law, mainly from a critical race theory and gender perspective. His panel is titled Continental European Post-Racialism. If Professor Newkirk would like to begin.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, if I could sing. What is her name? How amazing was she? Can we give it up again? Amazing. So the late Derek Bell, a dear friend and one of the architects of critical race theory, wrote, and I quote, "All of our institutions of education and information, political and civic, religious and creative, either knowingly or unknowingly, provide the public rationale to justify, explain, legitimize, or tolerate racism. This is the prism through which we might consider my research into the life of Oda Benga." On September 8, 1906, Oda Benga, a young man, a so-called pygmy from the Congo Free State, was first exhibited in the Bronx Zoo monkey house, at times with an orangutan. The exhibit drew record crowds to the zoo while stoking controversy and attracting global attention. But more than a century later, accounts of the episode have been distorted by omission, half-truths, or outright deception. Not only has Benga's captor, the self-described American explorer, been widely depicted as his friend and savior, but his true saviors have languished in obscurity. In addition, while Benga's bust remains in storage at the American Museum of Natural History, where he was temporarily housed, neither that institution nor the Bronx Zoo have accurately recorded Benga's story in institutional accounts, nor have they erected a plaque or other fitting tribute to his memory. Worse yet, shame over the episode has resulted in what can only be reasonably viewed as subterfuge by those charged with recording the history of the Bronx Zoo. In Gathering of Animals, the unconventional history of the New York Zoological Society, which we all know as the Bronx Zoo, first published in 1974, the Society's curator of publications leaves the matter of Oda Benga's exhibition vague, open to interpretation, or unknowable. Blithely ignoring overwhelming evidence in the zoo's own archives, William Bridges wrote, "Was Oda Benga exhibited like some strange, rare animal? That he was locked behind bars in a bare cage to be stared at during certain hours seems unlikely. That he did for the first few days enter a cage in the primate house to play with the chimpanzee that had accompanied him from Africa is certain. Also, it is certain that a label of information about him was hung on the front of the cage while he was in it. At this distance in time, that is about all that can be said for sure, except that it was all done with the best of intentions, for Oda Benga was interesting to the New York public. The incredible account goes on to say that after the uproar over the exhibit, Oda Benga was immediately withdrawn from official exhibition or employment, and the label was stored away. No evidence has been recovered that even mildly suggests that Oda Benga was ever employed by the zoo. On the other hand, there are hundreds of documents in the New York Zoological Society archives and elsewhere that conclusively show that he was intentionally and unapologetically, quote, locked behind bars in a bear cage to be stared at during certain hours. Bridges' account is but one example of the numerous egregiously false and misleading characterizations of Oda Benga's plight in the United States that have served to sanitize the episode and minimize his struggle. In many accounts, Oda Benga is depicted as a friend or protege of Samuel Werner and as a willing participant in his own degradation. Few highlight the extent to which he resisted his captivity or the ways in which this episode underscored the common racial attitudes of the day. While Oda Benga did not leave behind personal papers, his iron will is indelibly etched into the archival documents. Like other marginalized people, his daily activities and state of mind can be glimpsed in the margins of history, mostly in the letters of his captors and in dozens of newspaper accounts, and woven together, they provide a tragically stark portrait of Oda Benga as he faced the daily indignity of exploitation. The New York Times broke the story on September 9th, 1906, and over the 3 weeks that he was in the cage, published no fewer than 14 articles and editorials on Oda Benga's plight. The first story appeared under this headline, "Bushman Shares a Cage with Bronx Park Apes." The next day, on Monday, September 10th, the Times reported that even bigger crowds attended the zoo that Sunday. On one Sunday alone, 40,000 people went to the zoo to see Oda Benga. The article noted that Dohong, an orangutan, was placed in Oda Benga's cage that was now littered with bones to suggest cannibalism. The sign outside the cage read, "The African Pygmy, Oda Benga, height 4 foot 11 inches, weight 103 pounds, brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State, Central Africa, by Dr. Samuel P. Werner, exhibited each afternoon during September." Readers would learn that the iron cage Oda Benga inhabited had been built at the southern end of the primate house to keep the monkeys, who were sensitive to cold, warmer, and to make the antics of the orangutan plainer to the view of spectators. Quote, "Like his fellow lodgers, the orangutan and monkeys, Benga has a room inside the building. It opens like the rest into the public cage," close quote. From the beginning, Oda Benga's displeasure was palpable to observers. Quote, "Frequently he appeared at the door and in looks not hard to understand, let the keepers know he'd rather be among the trees and shrubs," a Times article said. Another article reported that a bewildered Oda Benga occasionally sat silently on a stoop, staring, at times glaring through the bars as spectators squealed with delight. Agitated, he occasionally mimicked the menacing mob. Quote, "From time to time, it looked as though the little bushman was running out of patience," an article said. Meanwhile, Bronx Zoo Director William Hornaday defended the exhibit, saying it was in keeping with human exhibitions in Europe, bringing to mind Sargie Bartman, the barely clad South African woman described as Hottentot Venus until her death in 1815. Hornaday said he planned to keep Oda Benga on display through the fall and possibly spring. As such, he prepared an article for the October 1906 issue of the Zoological Society Bulletin. In it, he described Oda Benga as a genuine African pygmy belonging to the subrace commonly miscalled the dwarfs. By Werner's own account, he had purchased Oda Benga with a pound of salt and a bolt of cloth to exhibit in the St. Louis World's Fair. As millions of Congolese people were being killed, tortured, and enslaved to feed the international appetite for rubber, copper, and minerals, Werner was hired as a special agent to procure pygmies for the fair. A deal finalized on October 22, 1903, authorized the allocation of $8,500 for Werner to procure, quote, one pygmy patriarch or chief, one adult woman, preferably his wife, one adult man, preferably his son, one adult woman, the wife of the last or daughter of the first, one female youth unmarried, 2 infants of women in the expedition, all of the above to be pygmies. So that was his shopping list. A year later, the fair would feature a massive human menagerie that included 2,000 Native Americans, among them the famous Sioux chief Geronimo, who at the time was a U.S. prisoner. A Philippine reservation was set on 47 acres with hundreds of Filipinos and 6 African pygmies, one of whom was Oda Benga. Oda Benga is the one, the second one, with his arms folded. On day 3 of Oda Benga's exhibition at the zoo, the Times ran an article expressing bewilderment over the growing protests. We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in the matter, they wrote. Oda Benga, according to our information, is a normal specimen of his race or tribe with a brain as much developed as are those of its other members. Whether they are held to be illustrations of arrested development and really closer to the anthropoid apes than the other African savages, or whether they are viewed as the degenerate descendants of ordinary Negroes, they are of equal interest to the student of ethnology and can be studied with profit. Meanwhile, letters exchanged between zoo director William Hornaday and Werner provide compelling evidence of Oda Benga's fierce resistance. In one, Hornaday writes, "Boy here became quite unmanageable, will not obey keepers and resist control. Think it unwise for us to punish him for several reasons. Call me or phone." In another, Hornaday wrote, "Finding himself immune from punishment, the boy here does quite as he pleases, and it is utterly impossible to control him." By then, Hornaday faced growing criticism, with William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal that morning condemning as bad taste and disgusting the exhibition, which he said held up African people to scorn. Meanwhile, in a letter from Werner to Hornaday, he proposed a solution. Quote, "If he should become too nervous, a dose of some sedative might be good, as I frequently found in the ecstatic frenzy which sometimes occur among the natives in Africa, though I never had to use it for him. 10 years after the zoo debacle, the New York Times, in an article reporting Oda Benga's suicide in Lynchburg, Virginia, described him as Werner's protege and dismissed as unfounded reports that Oda Benga had ever been exhibited at the Bronx Zoo. Fortunately, there is enough in the archives to definitively show what happened to Oda Benga, and it's possible to correct decades-old historical fallacies by drawing on a rich reservoir of untapped or underutilized documents that illuminate Oda Benga's unbridled resistance and utter humanity. Sorry, I've run out of time. Thank you.
Professor Newkirk and I had some conversation last night at a wonderful dinner, and we were talking about her wonderful book, and we were talking about how it is an example of how we distort history in order to preserve racial myths and in order to preserve myths of supremacy. And I want to talk with you just briefly about how that kind of distortion occurs in the legal context, and suggest that it's something that we should look critically for in every dimension of life. I say look critically, and I mean that in part as a reference to critical race theory. My colleague to my right is much more expert about than I. But we are both from the legal profession, which began this tradition of critical race theory. And it has many definitions and explanations. But the important thing to know, at least in terms of my own work, is that it helps us to uncover these deceptive stories with which we live. And it helps us to see how narratives, stories with which we live, which are false or incomplete, determine how we think about the world, and in my field, determine the shape of the law. So I've done a great deal of work for the purpose of uncovering a neglected and distorted history of anti-slavery and Reconstruction. I have done this because I believe that the United States Constitution ought to be understood not as the document of the founders of the original Constitution, but rather as the reconstructed document that had to be created after Civil War and after the decision to abandon slavery. Our Constitution was initially compromised in order to permit slavery, in order to permit the practice of treating some human beings not as people, not as persons, but as property. When that ended, at the end of the Civil War, the Constitution was amended for the first time to define citizenship, for the first time to set out a body of rights that citizens held, not only vis-a-vis the federal government, but as citizens and as people of the nation. I have been for some years looking at what I described, quoting a colleague of mine in a critical narratives of civil rights seminar that we teach in New York, calls the quest to move from constitutional property to constitutional personhood. That colleague is Bob Moses, an important figure in the movement pictures that Professor Willis showed earlier. And I've come to think of the struggle to establish what it means to be a constitutional person as opposed to constitutional property as something that's emblematic of the process we should go through in understanding the human rights and dignitary components of our Constitution. When I say that, I refer, particularly when I use the term dignity, to constitutions that are much newer than the United States Constitution, most of them post-World War II constitutions, that explicitly protect respect for human dignity, that explicitly guarantee respect for human dignity. This is something that has happened often after a nation has experienced some atrocity. The glaring examples are the post-Holocaust Constitution of Germany and the post-apartheid Constitution of South Africa. We find in those documents explicit statement that the human dignity of every person must be respected, and some definition of what it would take to do that. I would like to encourage us to think about the United States Constitution as a constitution that is also reactive to atrocity. It's a constitution that was redesigned in reaction against slavery, and a constitution that therefore embodies, even though it does not use the term, this notion of respect for human dignity. One of the advantages of seeing our Constitution in that way is that we might be in a better position to take advantage of the wisdom that comes from examinations of other constitutional systems that deal more explicitly with the concept of human dignity, and might have more of a global view of how the understanding of fundamental human rights should evolve. To what extent is this happening? The United States Supreme Court has members who are very resistant to looking at or looking for instruction from other countries and from other systems. But at the same time, it has members who have begun to talk about the concept of human dignity. I'm most familiar with that evolving conversation because one of my specialties is family law. And it's a conversation that really was generated as people tried to explain why certain rights that are not mentioned in the Constitution nonetheless are fundamental and exist. The right of abortion choice, the right of contraception choice, perhaps, tentatively, the right to die with dignity, the right not to be sterilized against one's will, the right to the sort of education that allows one to be self-defining and free. Now, of course, in this last, I stray from the field of family law. But the most recent articulations of this notion of dignity in the context of family law have been in the same-sex marriage cases. Indeed, they've been in the line of cases dealing with discrimination against LGBT people. And there too, there was a value that a majority of the court has wanted to respect that couldn't be exactly pinned to any provision in the Constitution, in part because one of them had been badly distorted shortly after the Civil War by the Supreme Court. But the court was searching for a way to respect those rights nonetheless. And you will see, if you look at the most recent, the same-sex marriage decision, a groping toward a notion of respect for human dignity such that each person should be respected as being self-defining, free to define herself or himself, within the reasonable constraints that apply in order that we might protect the public welfare and protect others against harm. With that, my time is up, and I will stop.
Thank you, first of all. Good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this incredible day. It's a particular pleasure as well to talk to the NYU students again after some years I taught here in Florence. And also, it's my first time that I see the cinema from the other side, because I used to sit in the places that you're sitting and watching the movies, so it's an impressive view, too, from this side. What I'm going to do in this presentation is sort of linking it to what you were just talking about, these racial myths and racial narratives, and how they play out in the European context, but using the tools of critical race theory and how they're helpful to explain some of those racial myths in the reality that you've come to live in the past months. So I call this Continental European Post-Racialism partly because obviously since Obama's election in the United States, there has been this whole discussion about the United States and post-racialism. And an eminent critical race scholar, Sumi Cho, has written a seminal piece on post-racialism in 2010. It's published in the Iowa Law Review, where she identified some of the elements, the key elements of what are the key elements of post-racialism. And she calls them here racial progress, race-neutral universalism, moral equivalence, and distancing move. I'll very quickly run through those before then looking at how these elements play out in similar way or in different way in the European context. Racial progress, this idea with the election of Obama, we've finally gotten there. Race is a thing of the past. We've made all this progress via constitutional amendments, et cetera, and this is now the moment that we've overcome. So this idea of an evolution, a sort of positive trend, and that we finally got to this point with the election of Obama. Race-neutral universalism, that finally, now that we have Obama, it's time to stop to envisage ourselves as Americans only, and stop thinking of us as African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, et cetera, and that ultimately this idea of having some form of race-neutral universalism is another element that identifies this post-racial narrative and story. There's another point that she highlights as moral equivalence, and this relates more to the measures and the legal measures that are adopted to fight racism, but that ultimately, especially affirmative action measures, are just as bad as racial segregation. And that there's an equivalence in legal interpretation, but not just that affirmative action is reverse discrimination. In Europe, we even use the term positive discrimination instead of affirmative action, which maybe gives this element of moral equivalence. So affirmative action is just as bad as, the Jim Crow measures of the past. And in that sense, this idea of moral equivalence that is enshrined in this new idea of post-racialism. Last but not least, obviously this idea of moral equivalence, just jumping back a second, is already present before the idea of post-racialism, but it's sort of repackaged, and I think this is in the last idea of hers. She talks about distancing move of post-racialism, and that post-racialism allows to present itself as the more hip and new kind of idea, especially race-conscious measures or racist behavior of the past, but also to distance yourself from critical race theorists who are advocating for race-conscious approach to law. And so that post-racialism is actually the more elaborate, more sensitive positioning, and that partly that Obama's campaign was also run on this sort of post-racial agenda, sort of because he rarely directly invoked race and the fact that he is African American, so that was part of this post-racial agenda. So how does this relate to Europe? So this is what I tried to do very quickly in the presentation. So how do these four elements here apply or not apply in the European setting? So first of all, this idea of racial progress, and I use it mainly to identify continental Europe, not the United Kingdom. There's slight differences here, so just to be aware of that. So this story about, that there has been a lot of racial progress done in Europe, partly, and I'll just list the things that when you talk to Europeans, well, we've done all these things. We've done these things, especially after World War II, the Nuremberg trials to address and try the criminals of World War II, restitution programs for Holocaust victims, UNESCO declarations on race in the 1950s and 1960s. The United Nations Cultural and Educational Organization has created these declarations in highlighting how race is a false term, non-scientific term. Equality provisions and, as we just heard, dignity provisions as well in constitutions, in post-World War II constitutions, the German constitution in particular, but equality provisions addressing those points. Last but not least, international law instruments, the International Convention, the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Here you just see the acronym ICERD, the European Convention on Human Rights, the EU Race Directives, the European Union Race Directives. So all these elements, if you see them all together, like, wow, a lot of work has been done, we've done it, we've overcome, we sort of moved this thing ahead. So Europe is a sort of, post-racial, from that perspective, we've done all this stuff. RaceNeutral Universalism, if you talk to the second element that Sumi Cho identified. And here race, again, when you're talking about universalism in Europe, race in Europe mainly evokes the Holocaust. So that by itself we need to overcome. We need to stop talking about this. Again, race in Europe as well is viewed as divisive. In France especially, they talk about communautarisme, this idea that if you identify on the basis of your race, of your skin color, you might be communitarian and furthering some form of identity politics. So this is, again, very similar to what you see going on in the United States context. Consequences are somehow different because of the different story. No to racial, ethnic statistics or census. So we don't have, if you as a student come here, you don't register, you don't need to tick any boxes here or self-identify. This in Europe is viewed as something that is dealt with, that has happened under the Holocaust. So we don't have these statistics or census. And there's some other element as a consequence, eliminate the word race from legislation and or constitutions. This is true for both France and Germany because it harks back to measures that were adopted in and under the Holocaust. Moral equivalence, very similar arguments here. Unconstitutionality of race-conscious measures, for example, in France, and I'll just run through these because I'm seeing the time is going through, but as well, moral equivalence of this idea of anti-white racism. So racism performed by a white majority against racial minorities in Europe is as bad as when someone from a racial minority attacks or insults someone that is white or Christian from that perspective. So there is the moral equivalence, which completely forgets about the power dimensions that are underlining here. So moving to the distancing moves, and here I think it most relates to these stories that are told, the myths and things that are being distorted by some of the stories and narratives. So one of the distancing moves here in Europe when you talk about racism is often, well, from sort of the old school American-style racism. And what you often get is like, well, Europe, we didn't really have slavery. We didn't really have segregation here. Don't bring this American notion of race and look at Europe through that lens. So you often get that reaction, I put it here, we have no slavery segregation, and I call it sort of geographical removal, because Europe, first of all, invented these things, and it removed them geographically somewhere to the colonies. So while it is true that if as a slave you came to Europe, and once you came to Europe you were free, whether in practice that always worked out nicely, that's pretty up to some historical research done, whether they then remained slaves or not, but that was the myth. So on European soil, those things didn't exist. That's one part of the removal. There's a second one that I call sort of racism and racist laws only existed under German occupation or under Nazi Germany, sort of this idea that I call the historical sort of removal, that you historicize racism to a very limited time period, forgetting all about colonialism, about Islamophobia, anti-Roma measures that are still in place. There is still Roma school segregation here in Europe. There are cases and cases before the European Court of Human Rights. So you see those ongoing. And so part of this myth for Europeans relies on these removals, on these kind of stories, while push it away mentally to Africa, to the colonies, and on the other side, historicizing it and limiting racism and racial participation, legal participation in racism, by also limiting it to, well, it was only under German occupation that all of this happened. As a consequence, again, limited recognition of race discrimination by courts, limited recognition as well of cultural racism, because a lot of racism, the way it's seen here in Europe, is focused on this idea of the Holocaust, state-sponsored extermination campaign, and so ultimately it forgets about all these other elements of racism that are present heavily in Europe. Somehow, I already mentioned them, EU-US differences on race. One obviously is in Europe, the reading of race and racism is almost exclusively through the experience of the Holocaust. So that is a given. Maybe in the United States, the other way around, it's through the story of slavery and segregation, but here it has a very different sense. I think it's also important to, maybe absence is slightly a strong word, but I'm talking to Roma experts in Budapest, and the difficulties of creating something like a civil rights movement across borders. Europe is split, there's language differences. If you're talking about Black Europe, there's difficulties to put across these language differences, the differences as well of history within this European context. So the absence of something that you could put up pictures of the civil rights movement, as we've seen this morning, the difficulty of finding something similar that would apply to European racial minorities. There is no such thing as European Obama. And even if there were, I'd have a hard time imagining that they would highlight as much the race, ethnicity of a candidate. It would probably have to be downplayed way more than Obama had to do in the United States. So we will be speaking, you'll be hearing about Cecile Kyenge this afternoon, while it was mentioned, but it wasn't running as the first Afro-Italian deputy minister here in Europe. So there is an issue there. Issues aren't framed in terms of race, and you would be chastised for doing so. Last but not least, I mentioned it already, racial statistics or census, and that links again to the focus on the Holocaust. What happens here in Europe, we don't have them. It's impossible to understand via statistics whether if you're Muslim, if you're Roma, you might be sentenced by a judge to harsher sentences than white majority, Christian majority person. We don't have statistics. So you would need to have experts going to court every day, and checking that out. So all of this is really a big difference, and part of what I say that Europe in itself, as a conclusion, sees itself, or many European countries, as post-racial since World War II, since after World War II, thanks to part of these racial myths. And these are some of the differences and consequences that maybe you as students encounter here when you live your everyday life. And so hopefully this might help explaining some of these stories. Thank you very much.